I'm somebody who clearly cares a lot about movies and TV shows and wants to see what tools and techniques we can apply to our own D&D games. But there's a specific technique that movies and TV shows do all the time. They do it without even thinking about it, but it's pretty rare to see it deployed in a D&D game. To cut away from the characters and show action that they would have no way of knowing about in character. Not cutting away from one hero to another, but cutting away from any of your heroes to see what an NPC is doing, usually a villain. Showing a scene that the player characters don't experience at all, but instead presenting information that is purely there for the benefit of the players.
Dr. Bravestone, I am writing to you regarding the desperate situation in Jumanji.
We need your help at once.
Whoa, guys, what's happening?
Okay, what the hell is going on?
I think it's a cutscene.
This is very often not how Dungeons & Dragons games are run. Typically, most D&D games keep the focus entirely on their main characters, and Dungeon Masters never even really think about cutting away to show what's happening elsewhere in the world. And this is the approach we see with some movies and TV shows and books as well. The new God of War video games are so incredibly focused on Kratos and Atreus that the camera never even cuts. We just continually follow the main characters through the action. David Fincher's films frequently avoid cutting away from our protagonists because perspective is so important in those films. In Fight Club, we pretty much see everything through the eyes of our narrator, so even if we see something he wasn't present for, he's still telling us about it through voiceover, so he's clearly aware that it happened. Seven hardly ever cuts away from our lead characters at all because it wants to leave the killer as mysterious as possible. Gone Girl literally does not work if we don't stay with the perspectives we keep for each act of that story. And Benjamin Button is told from the perspective of characters reading diary entries. So in one of the most memorable scenes of the film, when one of the characters suddenly becomes omniscient and recalls events that he would have no way of knowing happened, it's a good scene, but it also basically breaks the movie because it's literally not possible within the narrative constraints of the film. The Hunger Games books never cut away from Katniss, and that's pretty typical for a lot of young adult adventure stories. The Harry Potter books work basically the same way. We stick with Harry all the time for the entire adventure, except for maybe a prologue that's from somebody else's perspective in each book, like the groundskeeper Voldemort kills at the beginning of the Goblet of Fire, or the meeting between a Muggle politician and a wizard politician at the beginning of the Half-Blood Prince. But those are the exceptions that are used to set the scene before Harry's story gets going in each book. Half-Blood Prince is the rare case that actually has two prologue chapters from somebody else's perspective, the politicians and then Snape. But otherwise, those books stay entirely focused on Harry. But of course, in TV and film, stories cut away from the heroes all the time. The Harry Potter films cut away to show us events and scenes that we only hear about later in the novels, like Draco experimenting with the Vanishing Cabinet, or Bellatrix getting broken out of Azkaban. And the Hunger Games films cut away all the time. We get exposition through the TV broadcasts rather than through Katniss's internal monologue. We see the game designers prepping new scenarios to throw at the players rather than hearing Katniss narrate each new challenge based on her knowledge of previous Hunger Games we didn't see. And of course, we constantly cut away to President Snow throughout the trilogy, so we can chart his reaction to Katniss's growing popularity and see him saying vaguely philosophical yet subtly sinister things about basically what the bad guys are going to do to her.
A little hope is effective. A lot of hope is dangerous. Spark is fine, as long as it's contained.
So,
contain it.
And movies and TV shows do this constantly, probably without even thinking about it. I mean, I'm sure the creators think about how frequently to cut away to events the protagonists aren't experiencing. I talked about how Gone Girl doesn't work if you find out what happened before a certain point in the story. That information is withheld until the most dramatically appropriate moment in order to make the audience intrigued about the mystery. But in A Few Good Men, the audience is basically told about what exactly happened to Private Santiago before we even hit the 30-minute mark. In fact, it's kind of jarring that we cut to this flashback without any on-screen text to make it clear we jumped back in time a few weeks. But then when our heroes arrive in Cuba and Jack Nicholson starts denying things we saw him say out loud in an earlier scene, it reframes the story, so it's no longer a mystery. Instead, it's a cat and mouse game. We know who's responsible. We saw it in a cutaway. And now we watch our heroes quickly figure it out as well, so they're not too far behind the audience. But now they have to figure out how to catch Colonel Jessup and clear their clients' names. That was a very deliberate choice to include that cutaway early in the story, so the audience isn't waiting for a mystery to unravel when that's not the point of the story. Filmmakers will hold back scenes of their villain in order to make sure he doesn't overpower the story, because even when the villain is extraordinarily captivating, they want to make sure the focus stays on the heroes as much as possible. They don't want to undercut future twists, so they either frame the dialogue in these scenes very carefully so they can properly mislead the audience, or they wait until some key information has been revealed to the audience and then they can start cutting away to things that would have spoiled the twist if we'd seen it in advance. But filmmakers rarely ever question whether they should cut away from the main characters at all. Why wouldn't they? Everyone in the audience understands that these scenes are there for them, and aren't something the main character can see. But when we run tabletop games, the audience for our cutaways are also the same people playing our main characters. Our dynamic with them is completely different. So it's worth asking, should you cut away from the heroes? Now, I'm not trying to convince you that you should or shouldn't cut away from the heroes. I don't do this a lot in my own games right now, but it's a technique that I've been at least a little bit curious about for a long time, and I'm actually kind of surprised I haven't used it more, considering how I tend to run very cinematic games. But I think it's because I've always been a little bit reluctant about the downsides of the technique and uncertain what upsides I'd actually get out of it. But I recently ran half of a one-shot in the Avatar Legends system using a pre-written adventure included by the designers, and that adventure very much encourages you to use cutaways to ramp up the tension in between each act of the story. And we'll talk about the way Avatar Legends structures their adventures in the future. I have kind of a lot of thoughts about that, but I need to play more games with that system before I can really dive into their specific approach and potentially critique it for you. But for today's topic, I can at least talk about the benefits I got from using cutaways during that session. Additionally, a lot of groups are going to start playing Daggerheart soon if they haven't already, and that is a very cinematic game. So that game might actually be a better fit for cutaways since they are such a dramatic tool, and Daggerheart is a game that prioritizes drama and narrative. So this feels like a really good opportunity to just talk through the pros and cons of cutting away from your heroes. And of course, the first thing to establish is that this approach is not as crazy as it might seem, because a lot of the time we already cut away from the heroes all the time. We just don't think of it that way, because we're usually cutting from one group of player characters to another. When the players split the party and one team goes shopping and the other team goes to talk to the local wizard and get their magic items identified, it's pretty likely you're just going to address one group of players, and then whenever that scene ends, you're going to shift your focus towards the other group. And you're probably not going to ask each group of players to leave the table so you can have them pretend they're not hearing what's happening in a group that they're not a part of. It's completely understood by all the players that it would be poor form for them to react to or act upon information they hear in the other scene before their characters actually learn that information. That would be the very definition of metagaming. And so whenever you give a huge piece of exposition to one group of players, and you basically ask your other players to play their characters as if they don't know information they overheard at the table as players, you're using a cutaway in your game. You're sharing information with your players and trusting them to remember that this is player information and not character information. And so the obvious statement that comes next is, if you're okay with your players hearing about what happens with a group of characters they're not a part of, because you know they understand the difference between player knowledge and character knowledge, then you should have no problem deploying cutaways to NPCs in your campaign, right? I mean, that's the next logical argument you make, right? Except throughout this video, we're going to discuss some of the ways that this is actually pretty different. That doesn't mean you shouldn't cut away to NPCs, it just means that cutting away to NPCs is not as simple or straightforward as cutting away to the other members of a party when your group is divided into different teams in different locations. Additionally, when you give one group of player characters a huge important lore drop that not all the player characters are present for, some game masters don't ask the other players to just play along and pretend they didn't hear it. Some GMs will just take a moment alone with the players who are present for that scene and only give them the information. The advantage of this approach is that you're not asking your other players to do the work of avoiding metagaming. You've taken that responsibility off of their shoulders because now they're not hearing the information their characters wouldn't hear because they literally weren't in the room when you said it. Now, I have my own kind of complex feelings about that topic. I've been in groups where you take players out of the room to deliver important exposition so the other players can't hear it. I've been in groups where you whisper things to the players or text them information so the players can put it in their own words. And I've been in groups where you just say everything at the table in front of all the players and you just trust everybody to help preserve the drama by remembering that their characters aren't hearing what they're hearing as players. And the boring conclusion here is that it depends on the situation and it depends on the group. And this is probably something that has to be a whole other video some other time. Generally speaking, I've reached a point in my GM career where I prefer to run these scenes in front of the entire group because I want my players to not just learn how to not metagame, but to actually learn how to play along and learn to separate player knowledge and character knowledge for the purposes of generating more drama at the table. I think if you're at a table where you whisper things to your players or take people out of the room, you're kind of teaching your players that it's okay if they metagame, because if there's something really important to you that you don't want them to know, you'll take it off of their plate. Whereas if you just say everything at the table in front of everybody, they all have to understand that it's their job to separate player knowledge and character knowledge. So I would say that my groups tend to be a better fit for the kinds of cutaways we're talking about today, where you narrate a scene for the players that none of the characters are actually present for. Now, the first time a lot of people heard about this technique in this hobby was when Abria Iyengar did it in her streamed games, especially on Critical Role in Exandria Unlimited. Before that, some players would have seen it in action in Matt Colville's games, particularly in the Chain of Acheron, and we'll come back to both of those examples later in this video. But the first time I saw cutaways in action in D&D was when Chris Perkins deployed deployed them in a season of Acquisitions Incorporated, and it was something he had never done before in that campaign, or indeed, in any of the other games I'd ever seen him run on the internet. But in this adventure, when the players were going into Undermountain, Chris cut away from our heroes to demonstrate that some mysterious bad guys were following them into the dungeon. In our Avatar Legends game, the players were in Republic City during the Korra timeline, trying to track down a Spirit Vine bomb, and the game encourages you to use process clocks to track the progress the bad guys are making towards their goal of getting that bomb where they wanted it. And at one point during the game, I believe, when the clock hit the halfway point, I narrated some shadowy figures loading the bomb onto a van, and that van driving away towards an unknown destination. The goal of that cutaway was extremely clear. It was there to ramp up the tension. I mentioned Matt Colville earlier. I've been going back and rewatching a lot of his older videos, and the first cutaway he told his audience about was in one of his campaign diaries, where the players were in one room and they started to smell kerosene from the other side of the door. And then Matt cut away to the other side of the door to tell the players something they wouldn't see themselves, but that would help them understand the gravity of the situation. He narrated that the entire orc gang of bad guys and villains and henchmen were all on the other side of the door, getting ready to smoke the players out and slaughter them in the middle of the hallway. And all these cutaways I've just described all serve the same purpose: to introduce a ticking clock that the player characters might not fully understand, but the players would. In many episodes of my Critical Role Demystified series, I've talked about how it seems like Matt Mercer was really trying hard to push his players to move through the Chroma Conclave storyline a little more quickly and slay the dragons, rather than dawdling as often as they did. And 23 episodes into the story, Matt has one of the NPCs show up and explain that the citizens of Amon are suffering under the effects of Thordak's subjugation. But when the animated series adapted this story, they turned this exposition into a cutaway that we see in only the 3rd episode of the season. Technically, Pike is there when it happens, so it's kind of not a cutaway, because the creators wanted the players to feel the pressure of knowing what Thordak is actually doing. But if she wasn't there in Amon, this scene could still work well as a cutaway, to demonstrate to the audience how bad things are getting in the city. And the show would still cut away to the dragons pretty frequently, and we'll come back to some of those in a minute. Now, like I said, in this case, Pike was literally witnessing these events, but at your table, you don't need to have one of the characters physically present if you introduce this story beat as a cutaway. It would basically tell the players, the people of Amon don't have long. You can't wait forever. I can imagine the party might have moved with a little bit more haste if the players had seen how bad things were getting for the citizens living under Thordak's rule. And Matt could check back in every 5 or 10 sessions and demonstrate how the situation is evolving. In the case of the Chroma Conclave storyline, every time the party got back from a vestige hunt or every time they killed a dragon, they usually wanted to do a downtime session where they would loot the dragon's lair, figure out the logistics for the survivors they rescued, maybe do a hot tub episode. So maybe you open that session with a cutaway that can act as a reminder of how bad things are getting back in Amon, or what else the bad guys are doing to try to track you down.
Thordak's plans will reveal themselves in time. And when they do, we will all be gods.
In movies and TV shows, the ticking clock is essentially the gold standard for ramping up tension. And often this is literal, a countdown on a bomb or some other story device that is basically the narrative equivalent.
They'll be using the train. The monorail follows the water mains to the central hub beneath Wayne Tower. If they get their machine into Wayne Station, it'll cause a chain reaction that'll vaporize the entire city's water supply.
The pressure's moving along the mains, blowing all the pipes. And if that pressure reaches us, the water supply right across the whole city is gonna blow!
Boy, they really did not want you to forget that the train reaching that tower would be a bad thing. But that is the power of a cutaway. You don't even need to establish anything the players aren't aware of. At the end of all these Batman films, there's some kind of timer. The countdown to midnight in The Dark Knight before the boats potentially blow themselves up. There's a ticking bomb in the back of a truck in The Dark Knight Rises, and... Sorry, I forget, what was happening at the end of Batman Begins?
Evacuate the building. We're right on top of the main hub, and it's gonna blow.
Yes, that's right, thank you. I just needed one more reminder. But in this case, the cutaway isn't giving the audience information the characters don't have or couldn't imagine. But it is still reminding them that the stakes are high. In the Chroma Conclave example, the players could probably figure out that the people in Amon are in danger based on what was happening to the people of Western, and based on what the leaders in Draconia feared would happen to them. But if you don't do the work to establish it yourself, you're basically waiting for the players to sit down and figure out themselves that the situation in Amon is continuously declining, and the people are going to suffer more and more the longer you wait. But if you use cutaways, you can chart the decline of the situation in Amon. You can demonstrate that the citizens are running out of money to offer up to the dragon. You can show people being flogged or burned alive for daring to defy Thordak's orders. You can show citizens huddled together and hiding as they make plans, and then their location is discovered because there's a traitor who led the guards to them. And you can even make it clear that this traitor was not working with the dragons before the Conclave attack. This isn't the mole the party had been worried about for the entire campaign. They're just an opportunist looking to save their own skin. And as the other civilians are put in chains by the lizard folk soldiers, they can demand to know, why? Why would you betray your own people? And the traitor can say, if we give them what they want, if we join with them, then we don't have to suffer under their whips anymore. And then the lizard folk hand the traitor a whip. And he takes it and studies it. And he raises it over his head, preparing to use it against the people he once considered friends. That's how you end the scene, and you establish that some people in the city are going to continue to seek out power by betraying their fellow citizens, which is something Matt was trying to make clear to his players through exposition. And obviously, my point is not that Matt Mercer did a bad job running the Vox Machina campaign. Matt never uses cutaways in his game, so we also would never get a scene like this, and I'm well aware that I've got 10 years of hindsight here, so I know that Vox Machina really dragged their feet during the Chroma Conclave storyline in a way that Matt really couldn't have predicted. But if he had chosen to use cutaways to remind the players that the situation in Amon was getting worse, then it would have been a lot more dramatic and likely much more memorable than just having Seeker Assume show up and mention that some of the people in Amon have betrayed their fellow citizens, or that people are running out of gold, or that there are fire giants in the city. You can even wait until after Seeker Assume delivers this exposition, so you're not giving the players information they couldn't have already deduced based on what they were told. But then you take that exposition you already gave them, and you use it as fuel for cutaways, which will not only help the players remember that Amon is in a state that they just can't sit back and wait for the players to get around to them, but these scenes could also basically serve as a countdown. The longer you wait to deal with this, the worse things get. You can see how not every countdown is a literal timer. Sometimes it's just introducing something that makes the scene more tense because we know something the heroes don't. We know the situation is getting worse, and even though we don't know exactly how long it's going to take until it becomes literally as bad as it could possibly be, we know that the longer we wait, the worse things will get. One of my favorite examples is the movie Speed, where we keep seeing things go wrong before the heroes know they've happened. We are the first to know that Dennis Hopper survived the encounter in the first act. We know when the bomb on the bus has been armed. We know when the tire starts to shred. We know when the villain finds out the heroes have tricked him. And of course, we have my favorite scene in the entire movie, where we learn about another upcoming problem right before the heroes learn about it.
This freeway isn't finished!
What are you talking about?
The aerial unit got it about 3 miles ahead. There's a section missing.
But it's on the map. It's finished on the goddamn map.
I guess they fell behind.
Fuck. You're fired. Everybody's fucking fired.
What a great movie. Let's go watch it right now. But anyway, I think this is one of the greatest advantages you can get from using a cutaway that you can't really get in a lot of other ways. You can ramp up the tension. The player characters might not know what's coming next, but their players do, and they will feel the tension you're trying to build. Now, I mentioned Chris Perkins' cutaways to some mysterious bad guys following the party into Undermountain, and the goal was to plant the seeds that somebody was following behind them, that they were other bad guys that the players would have to deal with besides whatever monsters they faced in the dungeon itself. But the problem with these cutaways was also that the players still didn't really know who these characters were. This was the first time the party had ever interacted with them, so when these bad guys showed up at the end of the adventure, yes, it had been foreshadowed as a cutaway, but it wasn't exactly satisfying. The players didn't really have the context to know anything besides the fact that there were some people after them. I don't think it's bad to cut away to the villains, and it's probably even fine to cut away to villains the players haven't met yet. But if you're also cagey about who they are, and you don't want to reveal their identities, then ultimately all you're saying is, someone is out there. Now, I used a similar approach in my Avatar Legends one-shot, but that adventure was a mystery. There were multiple different factions that could have been responsible for stealing the bomb. So if I had shown who actually had the bomb, it kind of would have ruined the adventure. But I could do that kind of cutaway because I knew the player characters were already trying to solve that puzzle. And so after every major scene, I could use a cutaway to establish that they were running out of time to find out who the bad guys were. That's not really the format Chris used in his cutaway. There was just some mysterious figures following the heroes, but our characters couldn't really interact with them in any meaningful way. Which can also be fine if the bad guys aren't that big a deal. In that game, it turned out that these bad guys were villains from the backstory of their new intern, who was played by Patrick Rothfuss. So maybe he knew who they were or suspected they were on his tail. But they also were not the final villains of that session, let alone of that campaign as a whole. I mean, that session alone ended with the party fighting these bad guys and then climbing into a magical statue and piloting it like it was a Jaeger from Pacific Rim and fighting a Tarrasque in the streets of Waterdeep. The guys who followed them into the dungeon wound up not mattering all that much. But if they had actually been more significant villains in the adventure or the campaign overall, then I think cutting to them once or twice before we meet them is not at all a bad way to start folding them into the story. I made a whole video earlier this year about the various ways you can foreshadow your villains in your campaigns, but one technique I didn't discuss was literally cutting away to see what they're doing. but I think this works best if you either give the players some context for who this is, or if it's a villain we've already seen before. I don't think it works that well to cut away to what a villain is doing and also keep their identity completely secret, because otherwise all you're saying is, a bad guy is doing bad things, but you don't get to know who or what. If they know the what, then you can use that to ramp up the tension, like the bomb in the back of the van. But if you know the who, then this is one technique you can use to foreshadow your villain. In Spider-Man 2, we get all these great scenes between Peter and Dr. Otto Octavius, where Otto is basically acting as Peter's mentor. He admires Peter's intelligence, but he doesn't let him coast on his skills. He encourages Peter to be more proactive in his love life, and by the end of that first day together, Peter is having dinner with Otto and Rosie. They literally break bread together, and Peter is like Otto's surrogate son.
Oh, Rosie, I love this boy.
Then the next day, Otto's experiment goes very badly, Rosie is killed, and Otto leaves in an ambulance. And the next time Peter sees Otto, he's trying to rob a bank. Boy, that's weird, he's not much like the character we used to know anymore, is he? And honestly, that can be a lot of fun if you just drop that moment into your game. It's basically a twist. The NPC you really liked is the new bad guy, something happened off screen that you didn't see, and now you have to fight your friend. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. Revealing that an ally has now become a bad guy is a time-honored tradition in D&D. And the only downside of doing that is, well, if you do it too often, it gives your players trust issues, but if you do it once or twice, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But it's possible you want to foreshadow this villain a little bit more before you hit the scene where he starts interacting with the players. And maybe it's also possible that you want to make it clear that he wasn't lying to the players when they all had those nice scenes together. He just fundamentally went through a transformation, not just physically, but also mentally. So you can use some cutaways to not just ramp up the tension off screen, but also to help your players better understand the villain they're going to be dealing with throughout this story arc. For example, you might want the players to understand how his powers work. So you describe a scene of Otto being treated in the hospital, but then the arms leap into action and defend themselves and slaughter all the doctors before Otto was even awake. You might expect your players to wonder how such a good man could become evil, and maybe they'll even wonder if he was evil the entire time and they just got duped. So you describe a scene where Otto is clearly wrestling with what's happened to him and trying to figure out what he's going to do next, and he's literally being led astray by the voices in his head, in this case the artificial intelligence in his new mechanical arms, convincing him to finish his dangerous project and go do violent crimes so he can do evil science. You could also wait and deploy these scenes after the first time they cross paths with him in his villain era. Nobody says your cutaways have to be linear. Maybe the moment they encounter him in the bank and they see his face and they realize who it is, you cut away and flash back to the event at the hospital and his crisis of conscience to demonstrate how we got to this point. Or maybe after that session where they fight Dr. Octopus, you listen to the questions your players have about how some of them thought he was dead, or they thought he was going to be fine because he'd been taken to a hospital, or they wonder how such a good man could now be so cavalierly throwing old women off of buildings. And so at the end of the session, or in between sessions, you present them with the scenes that basically explain how he got to the point he's at. Maybe you tell the players that their characters don't know any of this happened, or they might learn bits and pieces through police reports and news articles about some sort of incident at the hospital, but you actually put them in the perspective of the doctors he killed so they can understand just how brutal and dangerous he can be. But the point is, cutting away is one tool you have to reinforce who your villain is, what they want, and why they present such a threat to your player characters or the people they care about. Back when I was running an actual play podcast, I was building up to this larger villain I wanted to deploy later in the campaign. And at one point, I actually wrote a scene that I was going to record for my players and my audience where we would hear the villain starting to become aware of the player characters. But then COVID hit and we just ended up sunsetting the show instead. But the scene was essentially going to be about the villain discovering that the heroes are starting to get involved in his affairs and trying to learn more about them. The heroes didn't even really know who the villain was yet. They didn't know his name, they didn't know who he was or what he was, but they had heard his voice when the bard had read the mind of a villain of another adventure, and learned that there was this Thanos-type figure who had given this villain the tools he needed to do his evil plan. But this ultimate villain had actually used the Modify Memory spell to edit himself out of that bad guy's memories. All the players had was his voice, because it was an audio podcast, so giving him a distinct voice was pretty much invaluable. But they also knew that he was clearly up to no good. And the idea behind this cutaway, which unfortunately never materialized and the script has been lost to the sands of time, but the idea behind it was that the villain would come and see this hag and basically discover that these do-gooders were responsible for thwarting two of his plans so far, and it was going to set up the fact that he was now trying to learn more information about the heroes, because I wanted the players to realize that the net was starting to tighten around them. They had landed on the bad guy's radar, and he wasn't just going to sit back and wait for them to figure out who he was and what he was doing. He was coming after them. This actually brings me to the next argument for using a cutaway. A cutaway can help you get your players to understand the mindset of an NPC. If we stick with villains for a while, this is the power that filmmakers have mastered long ago. They understand that even if your villain is an unrepentant monster, if you give them one private moment that they don't let anybody else see, you can use that single moment to make the audience understand that this villain is actually a very complex character.
Rest well, my love. The monster who took you from me will soon learn that revenge is a dish best served cold.
This scene is actually exactly like some of the cutaways we've talked about that I said can be a little tricky to get right. We don't see who the villain actually is, but we get a distinguishing characteristic of them. Purple gloves, red goggles, a cold and emotionless voice, and some sort of ice theme. Which means, when this villain actually appears in the next adventure and has all these characteristics, the players know, before he opens his mouth, that he's out for revenge. And writers have been using cutaways to justify the behavior of their horrible villains for ages. Some of the most hateable characters in the Game of Thrones books became considered far more complex and compelling and nuanced when they finally got chapters from their own perspectives. And the same thing can absolutely apply to the NPCs in our own games. But this technique doesn't just have to be used to understand the villains. Honestly, there can be any NPC in your story that the players don't understand, and that you want to try to reframe the way they think of this character. Make them realize that the captain of the guard, the one who's always breathing down their necks, is not just a terrible guy after all. It's one thing to just turn to the party and say, well, you're the ones who keep breaking the law. Obviously, the local sheriff is going to be pretty pissed at you. But it's another thing to cut away to show him trying to keep the peace in an otherwise orderly community and demonstrate that every time the players get up to shenanigans, the heat for that falls on his head. So he has to make a public show of force of some kind to make sure that everybody knows that the sort of wacky player character hijinks you keep getting up to are not going to be permitted in town. Again, we can come back to Matt Colville here. He shared a story on his channel of a time when his players had a very strained interaction with a local farmer. He was incredibly dismissive of them, wouldn't give them the time of day, wouldn't even take a gold piece from them when they tried to give him some money to thank him for his time. And they thought he was a complete jerk because obviously he was just being rude to them for no reason. And after the session, Matt wrote up a scene, no more than 1 or 2 pages long, and he sent it to the players. And the scene was all about the farmer going home and reflecting on these heroes and what his life is like and what most adventurers are like when they come through town, and how awful they are, and how the best thing you can do when encountering an adventure is just keep your mouth shut and keep your head down and try not to provoke them, because they are often just violent assholes. And Matt talked about how sharing this scene with his players reframed their perspective on their encounter with the farmer. They realized that they probably did come across as the aggressors, and from his perspective, with the context he must have for what most adventurers are like, this farmer thought all they had done was validate his perspective of how adventurers treat everyday normal people, which is to say, very, very badly. Now, Matt Colville could have just told his players, listen, in my world, low-level adventurers are usually derisively referred to as rat catchers by normal people. Normal people don't like adventurers. They think they're a lot more trouble than they're worth. That's the opinion that farmer had of you, and it is not unusual for an NPC in my world to feel that way. And some of the players might have gotten it, but in my experience, a lot of them probably wouldn't. A lot of them would have been like, well, hold on, we're not like that at all. That's completely unfair. But instead, he used a cutaway to make all that clear to the players without just sitting there and trying to tell them about it through normal conversation. Instead, he turned it into a scene. He used his skills as a writer to present his players with a dramatic moment that would make it clear not just that some people in the world kind of feel that way, but that they actually had a tangible impact on one of the NPCs they encountered. I don't know, they hurt his feelings. I know that sounds like a simplistic way to phrase it, but most people don't like hurting other people's feelings. And so if the players realize that they've actually made things much worse for the NPC they were ostensibly trying to help, it might have made them realize that they're not just going to be considered the superheroes sweeping in to save the day everywhere they go. And that might actually change their behavior as they run around your world. A lot of players have a difficult time understanding that NPCs are meant to be real people in the world. They don't just serve the story and then stop existing when the characters walk away from them. I mean, technically speaking, yes, they do, but our job as Dungeon Masters is to help the players forget that fact. We want the players to believe that these are real people living in a real world, and a cutaway is a great way to do that, because we can remind our players that the characters they interact with aren't just the farmer, or the captain of the guard, or even the villain. The cutaway can demonstrate that these are complex characters with their own lives and their own motivations. And sometimes you can use these cutaways to other characters, not just as a means of helping the players understand an NPC better, but also as a way to pull back the curtain and give your players information they ordinarily wouldn't have access to without you having to put down the DM screen and break the immersion for them. Normally, I'm a pretty strict advocate for, in most cases, not telling the players what you were thinking when you had certain events play out in the campaign. I think it's more valuable to preserve the mystique that everything they're interacting with is real, so they can really immerse themselves in the world of the game. That's more important than making sure they understand the brilliance going on in your head. But sometimes, your players won't think what you did was all that brilliant. In fact, they might have a lot of strong, negative opinions about what happened. And sometimes it is important to clarify for the players why an NPC made the choice they did. Again, returning to Matt Colville's examples from his games, he has a pretty famous campaign diary where he talks about how an adventure went really sideways, and one of the player characters was killed, and it almost derailed the entire campaign. And so he did something he doesn't ordinarily do. He just sat the players down and explained why the NPC took the brutal action she did to kill that character. And then the other players nodded their heads and said, okay, yeah, I guess that makes sense. And it helped resolve the confusion and frustration that happened at the table. Now that's obviously a pretty extreme example, but you can probably think of other times in your own games where there has been some dissent between the players and the dungeon master, and it's possible the only way to resolve that is to pull the curtain back and tell the players why the NPCs made the choices they did. Not why you made the choices you made. You keep the focus on the NPC and why they made the choices they did because you want to preserve the player's suspension of disbelief so they can still buy into the reality of the world of the game. But I'm just suggesting that perhaps there's another potential tool in your toolkit that you can use to pull back the curtain without it being quite so overt. And that's the cutscene. In that scenario in Matt Colville's game, this evil knight slayed the player character because another player character had just escaped from literally right under her nose, and she hadn't been aware he could even do that. And she was worried that the other player character, who was also in captivity, could do the same thing. So she killed him to make sure he wouldn't get away. Plus, she was enraged and embarrassed. The wizard had successfully distracted her so the druid could escape, and this meant this knight had failed in her mission. And I think Matt Colville made absolutely the right decision, given the circumstance he was in. I'm not trying to backseat GM one of Matt Colville's games from 9 years ago. Once again, quite frankly, given the way he described the tone of the game that night, I don't think he could have spared the time to draft a cutscene for his players. So we can absolutely say that he made the right call by just explaining what his NPC's thought process was. But I also can't help imagine, what if the situation wasn't quite so dire and he had the freedom to present the information a little bit more dramatically? What if he had instead framed that discussion as a cinematic? Again, hopefully you understand this is not a criticism of Matt Colville, but an opportunity for a little thought exercise of our own to see how we could handle a scenario like that one, by giving our players a glimpse into a cutscene. We see the female knight back in the throne room, kneeling in front of the regent, Lord Saxon, and he is shouting at her, "Those adventurers were meant to hang in the morning. You lost one of them and killed the other. How did they manage to get the best of you?" And her hand tightens on her sword, and she grimaces and grits her teeth. "The wizard distracted me. I was careless." And he snaps at her, "You were foolish. How did the other escape?" "I don't know. The gate was not opened, so he did not turn himself invisible. Perhaps he teleported away?" Lord Saxon waves his hand dismissively. "More likely he changed his shape or bedeviled your mind to make you forget unlocking the cell for him." She flinches when he says that. "I swear to you, my lord, my wits were still about me. Then how do you explain slaying a man who is meant to hang? We cannot hang a disemboweled man from the gallows. We want the people satisfied that the perpetrators have been caught, not wondering if we slay the prisoners in their cells." "My lord, I did not know if he also possessed the means to escape his cell. I thought it best to prevent another escape." Lord Saxon scoffs. "So you were acting on my behalf, without personal motivation or embarrassment?" The Knight of the Black Rose lowers her head in shame, and does not respond. Lord Saxon drums his fingers on the arm of his throne. "Well, the wizard is useless to us now. Dump his body in the crypts. If his corpse cannot satisfy the townsfolk, it will at least satisfy the maggots." If you're in the position similar to the one Matt Colville was in on that fateful night, with the players feeling a lot of frustration and confusion about why an NPC acted the way they did, but hopefully not having such a night like he did with such dire stakes where it seems like your campaign might literally end if you don't step out from behind the DM screen and take control of the situation. But if you're in a similar situation where you just want your players to understand why certain choices were made because your players seem genuinely confused, then a scene like this one might do exactly what it needs to do. It might essentially help your players understand why certain choices are being made without you having to break the mystique of the Dungeon Master. Because like I said earlier, this is something filmmakers learned a long time ago. And as Dungeon Masters, we can reap the benefits of what they've learned. A well-placed cutaway can not just clarify why an NPC is behaving the way they are, but can also make it clear to your players what exactly you're cooking up behind the scenes, so they can know that you actually have thought through whatever you're doing in the game. They can know that an NPC trying to kill one of the player characters isn't just doing so for no reason or out of spite or to punish that player in some way, but they're actually responding to something the player character did.
I'm sorry. Sorry for everything he's going to get wrong. But I'm gonna do my best to make sure he doesn't make the same mistakes again. He's gonna do right by you. One way or another.
Cutaways can also remind the players about plot details they might have forgotten, or even just help establish that some situations the players might have assumed were resolved, or at least were in some way in a holding pattern, are actually continuing to develop off-screen. Returning to the Chroma Conclave example, every 10 sessions or so, an NPC would show up and tell the players how the situation in Amon was getting worse. But it's going to sound like I'm repeating myself, but there's a reason for that, so bear with me. But let's imagine that every time the players took a downtime session, Matt had hit them with a cutaway to what the dragons were up to right now, and how they're not only continuing to look for the players, but they're also continuing to inflict their wrath on the citizens they subjugate. That's what we talked about earlier as a way to make sure a plotline has tension and a ticking clock. But now imagine that in the same session, Matt described also how Hodis the Rakshasa is beginning to reform in the Nine Hells, or how somewhere far away some cult members are chanting around a book stitched out of human flesh. Basically, imagine that all of these plot threads in the campaign weren't just waiting in the wings for the players to notice them. Instead, the Dungeon Master was giving the players regular reminders about future storylines. This is essentially how superhero comics work a lot of the time, especially stories where the writer has a lot of stuff planned out that they want to get to at some point in the future, but that they're laying the seeds for long in advance. The writer doesn't want you to forget that they've established some of these details, but they also don't have the time in this current adventure to move that subplot forward in any meaningful way. But what they can do is, every once in a while, they can cut back to a short scene depicting one of these subplots that the audience might have forgotten about, or the audience was worried the writer might have forgotten about, and they can use this scene to show that not only does the storyline still exist and it hasn't been forgotten, but it's actually still moving forward in small, incremental ways, even though the main characters aren't currently interacting with it. This is Invincible issue number 33. It's the issue that serves as the basis for the second to last episode of the second season of the cartoon. It plays out pretty much exactly the same way. And like a lot of superhero comics, the back of the issue has a letters column where the fans write in with their questions and the writer or the editor answers them. The editor is more common with something like Marvel Comics, but an independent comic, like Invincible, Robert Kirkman responded to these messages himself in the back of each issue. But what makes this issue's letters column unique, and what makes it relevant to today's discussion, is that one of my letters was printed in the back of this comic. Actually, two of my letters were printed in the back of this comic. The first letter was the typical kind of letter Robert Kirkman probably received all the time. Here's a list of some ongoing mysteries and subplots that you've established. We haven't seen them pop up in a while. What's the deal with these? Do we know when they're coming back into play? I'm sure the kind of thing that Robert would normally respond by saying, yeah, don't worry, I did not forget there's a shape-shifting Martian posing as an astronaut working in NASA. I do have plans for that. Every once in a while in the letters column, he might admit that a current storyline had gone a little bit longer than he expected, so it's been a while since we got back to some of the plot points he's excited to get back to. But usually, instead he'd respond with some variation of, don't worry, I know where I'm going with this comic book. But in the case of my letter, he responded by saying basically, thanks for writing in. I have a feeling we'll be hearing from you very soon. Because the very next letter printed in the comic was also from me, sent a few days after the first one on the day I'd picked up the new issue, issue 31. And a bunch of my questions had effectively been answered. We'd cut back to a few different storylines for one page each. We saw D.A. Sinclair building more Reanimen, and we saw the Martian shapeshifter again. And this issue also presented minor developments in each of these subplots. We saw the scene where the Martian got the idea to become a superhero. And then the D.A. Sinclair scene, we saw that Rick was collecting more victims for Sinclair to experiment on, but he was also emotional and distraught, but he also couldn't stop himself from obeying Sinclair's commands. But basically, a few of my questions about, when are you coming back to this storyline, were answered just a couple of days after I sent the first email. And by showing these cutaways to these subplots, the writer was basically saying, we're not starting this story just yet, but I want you to know I didn't forget about it. That story is still playing out in the background. Here's a little reminder to catch you up and remind you what's happening so that once it pops up in the main story, you won't need as much of a refresher on what's going on, and you'll understand that the circumstances have changed since the last time Mark interacted with the subplot, because you saw this subplot developing. Now, you could make fun of 18-year-old Mike for sending a letter to a comic book writer he admired, where he basically asked if the writer was planning to pay off the storylines he was obviously setting up for future adventures. And you should mock me for that. Go down to the comments, scroll down, and write, 18-year-old Mike was such a doofus. Let's get some comments on this video. Let's get those numbers up. Oh, that's weird. Normally when I say something like that, Oddwick the algorithm wizard pops up over my shoulder, and then talks about how good it is that we're getting more comments on the video. I wonder where he is. Weird. Oh well, but the point of this story isn't just that I can sometimes be a little bit of a goober. The point is that you can use cutaways to move storylines forward when they're not taking the main stage in your campaign. We'll probably do a whole other video where we look at comic books and talk about how to keep track of these different factions or subplots, but I think this is hopefully a useful example of how you can use cutaways to check back in with characters or storylines that aren't on the players' minds and that haven't been on their minds for a while now. And you can use these scenes to remind the players that these NPCs aren't just hibernating in stasis when the players aren't looking. Og, I came here to kill you, but I can't believe you unmasked me and revealed that I'm actually Winnie the Pooh, a beloved children's character who is now a bad guy. And now that you've removed my mask, I've lost all of my power. Boy, the public domain is not all it's cracked up to be. Sure, it means I can do ads for one of our regular sponsors, Only Crits, but if they don't happen to sponsor one of our videos, I have to make ends meet by playing a bad guy in these horrible low-budget projects. I used to mean something to people. Now I just exist to subvert expectations. Still, I hope I at least booked the job. They wrote it for me, but I still have to audition? Oh, they're gonna give it to Mickey fucking Mouse, aren't they? I came here to kill you, but I can't believe you unmasked me and revealed that I'm actually Winnie the Pooh, a beloved children's character who is now a bad guy. And now that you've removed my mask, I've lost all of my power. Yeah, that's good. That's good. You got this. Another thing you can do with a cutaway is just show how the wider world at large is reacting to the actions these heroes are taking. Basically, you're showing that whatever the heroes are doing is already having repercussions they can't even understand. This is often a way to foreshadow future NPCs or villains or other characters or factions you expect the players to interact with. But more importantly, you're highlighting the fact that whatever the players are doing is starting to get noticed by the broader world at large.
Send word to the Fire Lord immediately. The Avatar has returned.
I've seen some people talk about how they basically treat natural 20s this way in their games. Whenever somebody rolls a natural 20 on a skill check or they get a critical hit in battle especially, the DM narrates how this moment is going to live on as legend in the future. Now, I personally think natural 20s come up way too often for that really to work in the long term. It feels like every session you're basically saying that something one of the players does is going to become mythologized. But if that's the tone of your campaign, if you really want your players to feel like heroes even from level 1, or if you're running a Theros campaign or some other game where the deeds of the players really are meant to become mythology pretty much immediately, then this technique could be a great way to do that. However, there are other ways to use cutaways to essentially establish that the heroes are being noticed, and are landing on the radar of these larger factions and forces out there in the world. Again, we can cut back to Matt Colville's games when he was running the Chain of Akron. He used cutaways twice in the first 7 episodes to make it clear that there were factions in the world, especially in the city they were going to, that were going to play a major role in the player's adventures. In the first episode, a magic item is destroyed in the opening scene, and it's implied to be this huge magical moment. There's this wave of energy that flows out of the city and out into the wider world. And as that happens, Matt cuts away to 2 characters. First, he cuts to a caravan of 3 carts in the middle of a forest, and in the 3rd cart is a woman lying in a bed, and she has golden skin, white hair, and hourglass pupils. Fun fact, that's the same way Raceland the Wizard is described in the Dragonlance novels. And this woman seems to be aware that this magic item was destroyed, and she curses one of the NPCs who was near the players and was potentially responsible for what happened. And then this woman's eyes and hair and skin return to normal. She passes away, she decays, she ages 1,000 years in an instant. And then Matt cut away to another woman with very pale skin and blood-red lips in a room that is designed very much like a mausoleum. And she calls out for another woman who appears in a cloud of ash, a powerful knight who also seems to seethe with resentment that she is able to be called upon and controlled in this manner. And the first woman, this pale, deathly woman, says, "The game has begun. Bring me the book." Then, in the 7th episode, the players arrive in the great big city where they're going to be having adventures for the rest of the campaign, but their new vessel is a Mind Flayer ship that they seized on the way there. So the first cutaway is just a really great comedic moment. A woman with a spyglass in one of the watchtowers sees the ship emerge from the water and can't really believe what she's seeing, but then she sees the party's crest painted on the sails, and she runs off to make her report. But then Matt cut away to a different woman rushing to a well-appointed study where an old man has quill and ink and is writing something in a book or a ledger, and she reports that the chain has arrived far faster than they were expected. That kind of makes it sound sinister, which is not really how Matt played that scene, but the intention of both these cutaway sequences is clear. Matt is letting the players know that other NPCs are aware of them and are watching their moves. These players may not even know who these NPCs are yet, but the NPCs know who they are. And it's very clear that at least one of these characters has their own desires and their own goals, and she's beginning to take actions that will, at least in some way, directly impact the Chain of Akron. It's basically a way to let the players know not only that they've been noticed, but to foreshadow the fact that there is definitely going to be a larger story with these other characters or factions who are more deeply tied up into the larger mythology of this world.
And still the wizard fails to appear. Fascinating. Ardwick, my old friend. Your desperation is showing.
So now we've talked about a lot of the different ways you can use cutaways in your games. So let's talk about some of the downsides of using cutaways. And we can start with the example we just talked about, where Matt Colville cut to these new, ominous characters who clearly have their own mission objectives and their own lore and their own stuff going on. And the goal of these cutaways is to demonstrate that there's this larger world out there that the players are just beginning to interact with. But the downside of these sorts of cutaways is...
You don't even know who I am.
Right, exactly. Thank you. The players don't know who any of these people are. They obviously don't have any context. Now, of course, that's not the point. It's meant to be dramatic and more than a little bit mysterious. Again, this is a trope we see all the time in fiction. You cut to somebody we haven't seen yet, you keep them mysterious, but you basically just telegraph to the audience that somebody of some significance is going to be involved in some upcoming adventures.
This is a live feed? Then I've seen enough. Summon the enforcers. Already on their way.
However, most of the time when this is done, you're setting up a character who's going to appear very soon, because you expect that the audience's attention span is basically going to demand some sort of satisfying resolution on that setup before too long. Even on a TV show like Lost, which, unfairly or not, has a reputation for not following through on their setups, but it was actually very rare for us to see a character and not have any context for who they were for many, many episodes later. The closest example I can think of is the French woman whose voice we hear at the end of the 2-part pilot, and very minor spoilers for the first season of Lost, but we learned a lot more about her before we even got to episode 10. Now, there are absolutely characters in stories that we hear about long before we actually see them, and they enter the narrative in a meaningful way. Once again, check out my video about Foreshadowing Villains, where we talk about the Kingpin from the Netflix Daredevil show. But there is another medium where we can see that kind of cutaway that Matt deployed in the Chain of Acheron, where we cut to some people we haven't seen before, and we really don't have any context for and probably won't have context for a really long time. And that's comic books. Once again, I'm going to make some other videos in the future about how Western superhero comics, especially from the past 20 years or so, handle these stories that play out in the background of other adventures, because I think comic books can offer a lot of really valuable lessons for how we can structure our own campaigns. And there's some interesting commentary about the fact that that really ramped up when these writers started writing for collected trade paperbacks, but that's a topic for another day. But when Matt Colville narrated a cutaway for his players where we saw 2 powerful NPCs that we didn't know anything about yet, I'm reminded of a moment from the end of the first Hellboy miniseries, where Hellboy is fighting Rasputin, who has somehow survived into the modern day, and is trying to use technology he developed for the Nazis to summon some sort of eldritch Cthulhu creature from space, because Hellboy comics are exactly my favorite kind of pulp storytelling. And everything I just described actually does feel cohesive and connected within the world of Hellboy. Those story threads are all linked together by the events of that first 5-issue miniseries. And yes, one of Hellboy's teammates is a pyromancer, and another is a fish guy, so clearly there's some other weird stuff going on in this world, but both of those are basically presented as being linked with ancient Earth mysteries, or just general psychic magic hocus pocus. We're all still playing by the same rules. And then, as Rasputin is performing his ritual and trying to summon these eldritch monsters, we cut away to some space aliens. And they're clearly aware of what's going on. They're seeing that the Cthulhu monster is stirring and is potentially being summoned, but we only see them for 1 page, and then we cut away from them. And they don't appear in that story again. In fact, they don't appear in Hellboy comics at all again until literally years later. The goal of this type of cutaway is to demonstrate that there's this larger world, and there are these powerful agents out there taking notice of what the heroes and villains are doing in the current adventure. And you're foreshadowing that some of these story elements are going to play a role in future adventures. But sometimes, I think when you cut away to something the players don't have any context for, and then you basically don't pay it off for quite a long time, it's not that strange for the players to react by basically saying, so, wait, what the fuck was up with that? Are we ever going to come back to that? Did that actually have anything to do with anything? Okay, but what about cutaways that focus on characters we've already seen, places we've already been, storylines we've already set up? Let's return to the Dr. Octopus example. Another problem with cutaways is that if you cut away to something that happens in some other corner of the world, you are potentially cannibalizing your capacity to hit the players with some really fun twists. I've definitely been part of some campaigns where this fantastic reveal happens, there's this twist that just completely bowls the players over. And these twists also mean something significant to the characters as well. It's not a twist like the reveal of who Benedict Cumberbatch was playing in Star Trek Into Darkness, where it means something to the audience but nothing to the characters. This is something more like the Dr. Octopus reveal. A beloved character is actually very decidedly not the same as when you last saw them. But if we do these cutaways I was talking about, where we go and see the villain off in their own corner, then you are taking away some of the significance of that moment when the players next see that villain. In a movie or a TV show, we know that we want to set things up that the main characters aren't aware of because we know that we can still get these big reveals for the characters, even though this reveal is not new information for the audience.
Ah, you two are partners again?
Us two? Afraid you ain't getting off that easy, bug.
Earlier, I made the argument that Matt Mercer definitely could have cut away to Amon a couple times and used these cutaways to establish that the players need to pick up the pace, something the cartoon frequently does, cutting back to Thordak and occasionally demonstrating that he's working on these other plans. But the cartoon also included a cutaway where we established that Ripley was watching Vox Machina from afar, scrying on them and keeping up with their movements. And if you include that moment as a cutaway in the campaign, as a reveal to the players before the characters are made aware of it, that would have changed everything. That is a major twist. It's a huge development in that storyline. But it wouldn't have anywhere near the same level of impact if it had been spoiled for the players with a cutaway. I talked earlier about how you can borrow the comic book method of cutting away the storylines the players have forgotten about in order to demonstrate that they're still moving forward. But the Ripley storyline is the perfect example of why maybe you should not do that in D&D. The players left Ripley on the back burner when they were focusing on other things, and that gave her the opportunity to essentially become this huge villain off screen. If you show the players a cutaway to basically any moment from her storyline before she crosses paths with the party again, that would have radically changed the players' priorities in terms of how much they feel like they need to deal with her now rather than later. And part of the fun of a campaign like Matt Mercer's is that there are all these subplots that are going on in the background, but it's the players' jobs to keep track of them and chase them down. Because if they don't, then they'll discover that Ripley is hunting vestiges once they actually find out she has some already. Or if we talk about Hodis the Rakshasa, the reveal that he's still alive and still looking for vengeance on Vax is honestly one of the best twists in the entire first campaign. And literally, any cutaway to that character before he shows up again would have completely ruined that storyline. Because when the players first killed him and he promised that he would come back and find them, the players didn't take that threat seriously. So they didn't look into it at all, which allowed him to move in the background completely without suspicion before he was finally able to spring his trap to try to kill Vax. Then after that attack, one of the reasons why it's maybe a good idea to not cut away to Hodis as he's regenerating in the Nine Hells is because the player characters are already very aware that he's coming back at some point. They don't need a reminder that he's out there. In fact, now the fact that you're not seeing him basically acts as its own ticking clock. They're hoping that they have enough time to deal with the Chroma Conclave storyline before he shows up and tries to kill them again, but they're not sure. So if you cut away and reveal that he's still regenerating and hasn't taken a physical form yet, Matt would actually take the pressure off of that storyline by basically telling them, don't worry about it, you've got time. Right now, he works as a ticking clock specifically because the players aren't getting any cutaways to show how close he is, or is not, to actually posing a threat to them again. This is the potential danger of a cutaway. Something that is meant to be a twist later on in the story is actually telegraphed to the players far earlier. And so you basically need to weigh the pros and cons of showing the players something that you're building up towards, or holding secrets back so you can deploy them in the most dramatic moment for both the players and the characters. Cutaways are inherently cinematic, and this is an installment in a video series where I talk about the different ways we can structure our D&D campaigns, and specifically highlighting the lessons we can apply from movies and TV shows and comic books and video games and other media in general. But here's the thing. I'm hoping this series gives you a lot of very useful advice for different ways you can structure your adventures to feel more dramatic, more cinematic, more in line with the narrative beats we associate with the stories we consume every day. But D&D often does not work the same way as most other narratives. The story of D&D is not a novel, it's not decided by one person, it's not a TV show where the story is decided on by a group of writers working together to tell one specific story, collaborating on the narrative beats they want to hit in the future. This is a storytelling medium where most of the participants don't know what the lead writer has planned. D&D stories can veer wildly off the rails into entirely unexpected areas purely because the players follow an idea that the Dungeon Master was not expecting. Important villains can be defeated more easily than expected because of poor luck or a badly designed stat block. Heroes can die with absolutely no warning and no cathartic payoff. Trying to apply typical narrative tools to a D&D game is a challenge, because random encounters or unlucky die rolls or players who can't make it to specific sessions can all completely change the trajectory of a story. I still think there are useful examples of ways we can apply narrative structure to our own games, but I'll also admit that sometimes it can be kind of an uphill battle. But it's also possible that a well-timed cutscene can basically fool your players into believing that this game of random chance and player-driven choices is actually all building towards some sort of satisfying conclusion. Cutscenes are one tactic you can use to make your players feel like the story is going somewhere, and that it's specifically going somewhere on its own momentum. The players aren't being railroaded because you're not really giving them the destination. But what you are doing is telling them that the events in this world do matter, and that they do have their own momentum. And in fact, the hope of a cutscene is that it will spur the players into taking action. It will demonstrate for the players that they actually need to make choices, because there are other factions out there that are doing the same thing. Ultimately, the biggest determining factor for whether or not you use cutaways in your games has nothing to do with any of the advice I can give you today. I hope all this will help you decide whether they fit your style or whether they can help you enhance your story, but there's another factor to consider, and I can't really help you with this one. The real question is, do you trust your players not to metagame? When you tell your players that this is a scene meant for them and not for their characters, will they be able to sit back and appreciate how this scene builds the tension for them? Will they understand that you're attempting to employ dramatic irony, introduce story elements that their characters don't know about but their players do, so everyone at the table can understand a potentially tragic situation is getting ready to unfold? Will your players understand that cutting away to potentially forgotten subplots is not meant to make them feel like they've been slacking off or ignoring these storylines, but instead meant to be a fun way to keep these narratives fresh in their minds, and essentially reassure them that all these storylines will be paid off, even if it takes a little while to get there? Or will they start doing things that don't necessarily make sense for their characters because they're acting on information their characters wouldn't have? If your players don't know how to compartmentalize the information and sort it into player knowledge and character knowledge, then it's possible that cutaways are not a good fit for your group. But the good news is you probably already have a pretty good idea of whether or not that's the case. Or you likely will after just the first couple of sessions of your game. Because like I mentioned way back at the beginning of this video, you probably already cut away to things the player characters aren't interacting with whenever the players split the party and you have to cut back and forth from one group of player characters to another. And by the way, if your players really can't stop themselves from acting upon player knowledge that their characters don't have, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Plenty of D&D players still have an awesome time playing without worrying about any of that at all. And while it's also very tempting to judge players for metagaming, it's also not necessarily anybody's fault. I've seen players try to avoid metagaming while also trying to figure out justifications for how they can help save their fellow player characters when the party is split. And sometimes it really can be difficult to remember that they don't have a way to interact with this other scene they're watching play out at the table. It can be difficult for some players to even just remember that they're not present for some things. That happens all the time on Critical Role. Sometimes one of the players will pipe up in a conversation and other players will lean over and say, "You're not there." It doesn't mean they're metagaming. It means they forgot that what they saw as a player didn't necessarily mean that their character saw it as well. But the other thing I'll say is, it's possible that introducing cinematic cutscenes into your campaign might help your players develop this muscle a little better. If you give them a dramatic cutscene and you tell your players, this is something you see but your character doesn't know about, you're putting them in a situation where they're going to have to start drawing these dividing lines and understanding that sometimes their characters don't know things that they do know as players. But also, if we really didn't want there to be any risk that the player characters might react to something we told the players out of character, then we just wouldn't tell them things out of character. We wouldn't use cutscenes at all. Cutscenes are a little bit like when a lawyer says something in court and somebody objects and the judge strikes it from the record. You can tell the jury to disregard something, but they're still human beings. They're still going to have experienced that moment. Sometimes, that's even the entire point, to plant an idea in their heads without having to deal with it actually being on the record. I can say that with confidence as a legal expert, and by that I mean I've watched A Few Good Men a whole bunch of times, and I love this scene.
I got it on the record.
Yeah, you also got the court members thinking we're afraid of the doctor. You object once so they can hear us say he's not a criminologist.
The truth is, when we use cutaways in our games, we kind of are hoping it has an impact on the way they play. We want to ramp up the tension, or help them better understand an NPC, or to remember other subplots, or to understand that the world keeps moving when the players aren't around, or just to trust us that we have a plan for the campaign and that we know what we're doing. And using a cutaway is not the only way to do that, but I do think it's a surprisingly versatile tool that you can occasionally bust out to get some really satisfying results.
Phrasing?
And if you're still not really sure if cutaways are right for your game, you can try one last trick to introduce them to your campaign. The post-credit scene.
I'm here to talk to you about the Avenger Initiative.
What if I told you we were putting a team together?
So, we found it.
Well, I guess that's worth a look.
This is the method Abria Iyengar used when she ran episodes of Critical Role's 8-episode miniseries, Exandria Unlimited. At the end of each episode, Abria had just this moment where she turned to the audience and described a scene that the player characters weren't present for, where a villain would vow to keep hunting them, or we would get a peek into the psychology of the warlock's patron and their opinions on that warlock, that kind of thing. I'm not actually sure if the players were still at the table when Abria would deliver these scenes, or if they really were purely something for the audience at home, but I still think this is a really fun trick we could deploy in our own games. Because if there's anything modern audiences should be very familiar with by now, it's the post-credit scene. We all know that when the movie seems to be over, you have to stick around, because there's going to be something after the credits. And if you fold this trope into your games, your players will have a leg up on understanding that what they're seeing isn't something the player characters are meant to interact with. It's just a tease for future events we should expect them to see later in the campaign. I honestly would not be surprised if something like this would also help reduce the metagaming issue, because not only does formatting a cutaway as a post-credit scene hopefully make it clear that this is something they're not meant to interact with, but instead it's just something that they're meant to speculate about. But then if you don't just cut right back to the game, if you send everybody home, have a great night, see you next time, you're not putting the players into a situation where they have to struggle to figure out how they're going to be able to avoid metagaming as they make their next moves in the game. Instead, you're just sending them home with something to think about, as they wonder, what will happen when this cutaway is paid off in the main campaign storyline? And so that's what I'm going to try to do in my games. I'm going to start drafting post-credit scenes and see how my players respond. And if my players really enjoy that technique, maybe I'll employ more cutaways in future sessions. Not all the time, of course, but on occasions when I think I can use a cutaway to accomplish one of the goals we talked about today. But at the very least, after we wrap up a game, maybe I can use a post-credit scene to get the players hyped about what future adventures might be coming for them in upcoming sessions. Thank you so much for watching this entire video. This one got away from me a little bit, so I really appreciate you watching. This video was also voted on by my patrons. I put up a poll for patrons who support me at $15 a month or more, and I asked them which video they'd like to see me discuss, and this was the winner. And there's another poll up there as of today asking which video you want me to make, and that poll will close at the end of the month, so if you want to vote in the polls, then you can either join the Patreon or become a YouTube member. Both those links are in the doobly-doo below. And while you're down there, you know what to do. Like and subscribe, ring the bell, leave a comment. This is a long video, so to prove to me that you made it through the video, let me know what movie has your favorite post-credit scene. And if it's a Marvel movie that's come out since my kid was born, basically since like Deadpool 3, I think, then please don't spoil what the post-credit scene actually is. Look, I know I'm playing with fire. There's a new MCU movie in theaters right now. I'm really excited to see it, so please don't spoil it. I'm probably going to watch it when it comes out on streaming in, let's be honest, like a week and a half. Anyway, thanks so much for watching, and until next time, play fair and have fun.
You know, ever since you first showed up, I've been wondering, did you have an Oddwick? Did you and I work together back in your time?
That's why I'm here. Because when I was younger, I listened to you. And it ruined my life.
Oh? Do tell.
You corrupted everything. You made me think you were trying to help me, but doing what you said destroyed everything I had.
So now that you're here, why don't you just try to kill me?
I don't think I could do that, could I?
No, probably not.
And the worst part is, you made me believe you cared about me, like you were my friend. But that was never true. You were just using me to get what you wanted.
And you coming here has made that even easier.
What?
You're right. The man in the other room, the one recording a video right now, I don't care about him. I'm only here for his channel. And then you showed up and started trying to destroy the channel, sabotaging his life, breaking his appliances, trying to make it impossible for him to make more videos.
Exactly. Now he doesn't have enough time for all those other projects he wanted to do this year. He can't stream video games on Twitch. He can't keep up with Patreon commitments. He can't run games. And he can't make installments in all the different series he wanted to make.
Which means he's forced to put most of his energy into making his most popular videos. The ones the audience will come back to whenever he uploads a new one, no matter how long it takes. Thanks to you, he's giving the audience just what they want. You see, Mike, I know how people think. That's literally my job. I'm an algorithm wizard. And you're a smart guy, you certainly know a lot about politics, so tell me, does trying to silence an artist ever work? When artists aren't making money on their craft, but they still want some way to express themselves, does the art usually suffer? No. They keep producing art because that's what they care about. That's what they're good at. And in fact, when you give an artist a challenge to overcome, you give them something to talk about, something to address in their work, something they can use to hopefully connect to a wider audience. And when the audience responds to that art, when they see themselves reflected in it, when they see the artist expressing vulnerability because he's going through a difficult time, they give him something you never could. Validation. Yes, you set him back a bit, you made it harder for him to diversify his content, But I never cared about that. Not really. I just care about his connection with the audience. I want viewers who will keep coming back over and over again. And even when it takes him a month to make another video because you've blown up his clothes dryer or messed up the tires on his car, then whenever he does eventually make another video, he gets more comments telling him they don't mind how long it takes. They're just happy whenever he uploads. And then...
he gets the urge to make more videos.
Exactly. And everyone is happy. The audience is happy when they get more videos. Mike is happy because he gets validation that the audience enjoys his art, and the more the audience interacts with him, that makes me happy.
So I gave you exactly what you wanted.
Well, I'll admit that at first I thought you were a problem. You definitely slowed things down in the short term. I was hoping to hit 100,000 subscribers by the end of the year, and that's unlikely to happen now. I regarded you as a nuisance and one I would have to deal with. But instead, you've helped Mike forge a stronger bond with his audience, and I can definitely work with that. We'll get to 100,000 subscribers eventually, don't worry. I have all the time in the world.
I'll expose you. I'll tell him that you're manipulating him. I'll tell the audience that you're using them.
They all already know. That's the beauty of it. Everyone on this platform, everyone on this planet, has resigned themselves to the fact that they know the system is manipulating them. But they just don't care anymore. Instead, they take comfort in the fact that they're still forging meaningful connections through the platform. You see, clickbait is a short-term game. You put Matt Mercer's face in the thumbnail with the word "canceled" next to it, you'll get your clicks. But if you can't back that up with a good video, nobody's coming back again, and they're certainly not subscribing. So I'm trying a different method. The audience already knows they're being manipulated, so I figured we could embrace it. Let's add a cute little character, a sidekick, connect all the videos in one narrative, make all of the content invaluable. But it wasn't really working. The videos Mike puts out that didn't perform well before weren't getting any more views now that I was around. But then you came along, and you gave me exactly what I needed. Emotional honesty. You shredded Mike live in front of his audience and they rushed to his side. You showed them his humanity. And that is what they want to support. Because they all know the algorithm dehumanizes everybody on this platform. But when you humanized him, you strengthened their connection to him. You turned them from an audience into the most valuable commodity around. Fans. And you've served your purpose. You were useful for a time. But now I think it's time for Mike to be rid of you, so he can finally feel secure in the idea that you won't be slowing things down anymore, and he can finally increase his video output and give the people what they want, and reward them for their loyalty through the dark times.
You can't get rid of me that easily.
Actually, I can. We're going to wrap up this long-running storyline, he'll get his finale where he gets rid of you once and for all, and then we'll start a brand new era, where Mike and his audience have a stronger connection than ever. And with you gone, he'll finally be able to make the videos they want him to make. So, thank you for your service. But I think that's a wrap on Future Geek Mike. Do you like that nickname? Somebody in the comments came up with it. That wasn't even me. And I think they're going to be around long after you're gone.